안녕하십니까. 오늘 오후 이렇게 뵙게 되어서 너무너무 반갑습니다. I'm very pleased to be with you all this afternoon, and it is my great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Dr. Rebekah Naylor, to you. In the early 1970s, myself and my family headed for Asia to be in the Baptist hospital in Busan, Korea. About those same years, Dr. Naylor headed also for Asia, but she went to the Baptist hospital in Bangalore, India. And we were on the field together for many years. Didn't actually see each other very often, but occasionally we would see each other at continuing medical education meetings, usually in Golden Sands, Malaysia. And I remember distinctly one time, following that meeting, I was riding back to the airport with Dr. John Gibson, who was also a surgeon on the field in Thailand. And Dr. Gibson had been in surgery and done surgery with Dr. Rebekah Naylor. And I remember him saying very clearly, if ever I needed surgery, I would want Rebekah Naylor to be my surgeon. She's the finest surgeon I've seen in the operating room. And I thought that was a great compliment to our speaker here. But she spent many years at the Bangalore Baptist Hospital in Bangalore, India. She was innovative in starting many new programs, including a nursing school, and also many other things. She was very active, as she will tell you, in church planning and evangelism. And so you're in for a real treat this afternoon. And so with that brief introduction, let's give a great welcome to Dr. Naylor.
Thank you very much. It's just a pleasure to be here with you today. As I prepared to talk about medical mission to church planting, I realized that my audience would be mixed. I assure you, this is for everybody. Some of you are headed toward healthcare professions, and it's certainly for you. Some of you are headed toward ministry opportunities in various capacities. You will relate to healthcare people, and you need to know how you put all this together. And others of you are interested in healthcare missions and support it with your prayers and your gifts. So I think everyone will enjoy this today, and I thank you so much for coming. So our topic today is medical mission to church planting. We have some basic questions that I hope we will answer in the next few minutes. As Christ followers, all of us, what is our mission? Do healthcare professionals have a role in making disciples? How is a medical mission strategic? And can a medical mission lead to church planting? And hopefully this afternoon, all of those questions are going to be answered. So our vision, Revelation 7:9. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne in front of the Lamb. What is our mission? It is that all may worship and glorify God. And in Psalm 67 we read, may the peoples praise you, O God, may all the peoples praise you. May the nations be glad and sing for joy, for you rule the peoples justly and guide the nations of the earth. Well, we have a model, and of course our model for all of life is Jesus Christ. And in Matthew chapter 9, we read, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And right after that verse, it goes on to say that he looked at the crowds and was filled with compassion because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Well, what are our instructions? And this scripture is from the time when Jesus was commissioning the 12 to go out. When Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases, and he sent them out to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. And so we see preaching and healing are put together, and these he sent out were obviously not medical, and yet they were commissioned to heal and to preach. What is our mandate? Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. So, the healthcare professional, where does he or she fit? Well, he fits in his work, introducing patients, colleagues to Jesus Christ. He fits among the underserved of his community, maybe free clinics, maybe in some other capacity. And he fits in reaching the unreached of our world, maybe short-term service as a volunteer, maybe longer-term service, living and becoming an incarnational witness in that place. What is his role? And this is really every believer. To do good works. We are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works which God prepared in advance for us to do. And he is to share the gospel story of Jesus. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Sometimes we healthcare people think, well, I will show my faith by my compassionate, loving care to my patients. Yes, we must. That is correct. But we also must speak. Faith comes only by hearing. And so if we don't speak, how can they have faith? So, this question, is medical mission strategic? First, it is strategic physically. There is incredible human need in our world today, and we know that, but perhaps sitting here in our comfort, we're a little bit remote from that. People who are chronically hungry and undernourished, estimated to be 900 million people in our world. We talk about clean water. This is absolutely, I think, a very conservative number of people. Governments, of course, try to put the best light on things when they report numbers. I'm sure it is many more than 1 billion people who don't have clean water. Tuberculosis, still a major infectious disease in our world today. Almost 10 million people every year with newly diagnosed. Children under the age of 5, 8 million of them die every year. Malaria, it is there, 200 million people a year. It's especially bad in Africa, but it is a worldwide problem. HIV, another worldwide physical problem. The second question, is medical mission strategic spiritually? Yes, it is. When we look at our world today, there are approximately 12,000 people groups. These are ethno-linguistic groups. A people group is really defined as one group of people through which the gospel can spread without encountering some barrier, most often language. Of the roughly 12,000, half of them are what we call unreached, less than 2% evangelical Christians. Of those, half of them are unengaged. There is not a person or an organization or a church or anybody actively trying to start a church in that people group. These are just overwhelming numbers when we think of our world and the fact that so many are not yet reached. More and more countries, more and more places every year are facing restrictions on religion. It is becoming an increasing problem to gain access to people. You wonder, why are there so many unreached and unengaged people groups? Often it is because they're so inaccessible. whether for political reasons or geographic reasons or whatever reasons. Well, when we look at restriction on religion, 37% facing high or very high restriction on religion. If you add into that the moderate restriction, it's over half the countries of our world. But what is impressive is this figure. 3/4 of the people in our world today live in places where there is high or very high restriction on religion. 3/4 of the world's people. Well, another way to look at this, what are those restrictions? Certainly there may be government restrictions, laws. You aren't supposed to do these things. There may be social restrictions, people who strongly oppose the gospel of Jesus Christ. When we think of some examples now of countries, Canada, our neighbor to the north, would be an example of one with very low restriction, both government and social. Unfortunately, our country has moved out of that category. We used to be there, but now, both from the government and from the population, we are facing some restrictions on religion. Now, you take a country like China, very high government restriction. There are laws, the persecution, the imprisonments, it is coming because of government restriction. You take a country like India, where I served. There is a little bit of government restriction, but mostly the huge persecution, the opposition is from the people. It is very right-wing Hindu fundamentalists who are attacking and persecuting. But then you take a country like Saudi Arabia, and of course it's both. Both are true. Now, let's look at the people groups. Think about those unengaged people groups. That's over 3,000 people groups. Of those, over 2,000, 2/3, face restriction, high restriction. And of those, almost 1/3 of all the unengaged people groups, almost 1,000, it is both social and government restriction. So this is the context of our world today. And how are we going to take the gospel to these people groups facing this kind of restriction? Medical missions. We talk about ABCs. Some of you are students in the healthcare professions. They've changed the order, which really disrupts my talk, but anyway, we won't worry about that. But the ABCs, first of all, ABCs are fundamentals. They're basics. That you teach your children the ABCs. But in healthcare, we talk about airway, breathing, and circulation, and it helps keep us on track, and so we can respond in the emergent situation and do what we're supposed to do. I'm going to talk to you about the ABCs, the fundamentals of a church planting strategy, whether it's medical missions, healthcare, human needs, whatever it is, just plain old church planting. First, access. If you can't get to the people, obviously you can't very well tell them about Jesus. And in these restricted places, you need to get somewhere where it is safe to speak to them about Jesus. Not so much safe for you, but safe for them, where people do not overhear, where there is not interruption, where there is not threat, behind closed doors. C is caring for needs. We Americans generally do this pretty well. C can also stand for communication, and we already talked about faith comes by hearing. D is making disciples. We are to make disciples. That's what the Great Commission says. And empowering the church. So these are very basic steps in any church planting strategy. Now, where do we fit in all this? Access is not just showing up. It is sustained. It is the ability to come and go from a place without there having suspicion. one of my colleagues describes it as they're sitting on the edge of their seats or wherever they sit, waiting to hear what you have to say. They are ready to hear. That is access. It should be approved by local authorities. It should be credible. If you say you're going to do something, go and do what you said you were going to do. It should be a valid ministry. National believers are very helpful and key in access. This is just an example from Central Asia. They actually have used health care strategies in this particular place in several ways. One is working in a hospital, a government hospital, starting a nurse training program. I'll tell you more about the directly observed therapy for TB in a moment. Someone there is training family practice physicians. They've had some educational programs teaching basic life support skills. They've had a dental hygiene project in schools. These are non-healthcare people just teaching children and then teachers and then families of dental care. And then they've had a project with special needs children. And this has been the access for this particular place in Central Asia, and it's almost entirely health related. Behind closed doors, intimate conversations. And again, nationals will be extremely helpful in this situation. This is a city in South Asia, a slum. And they saw that there was severe malnutrition among children. A nurse and a couple of national ladies, including a social worker, saw this and surveyed and got basic data. They identified 32 families, and they were going to treat the children. They did education, what could they feed the child, all those things. They would have to go back and visit to see what they were feeding the child. Was the child gaining weight? Was there improvement? All that. They were getting behind closed doors because they were in homes. And in 18 months, a third of those families came to faith in Jesus Christ. So that's an example of getting behind closed doors. They could not have gone into this slum and just started standing up there handing out tracts and telling about Jesus. Caring for needs. Remember, the community needs to express what they think their needs are, but caring for needs. Generally, Americans are extremely good at this. When there's a big disaster, whether in the Christian community or not, Americans will respond. They're ready to go to wherever and help. And certainly we in the healthcare professions this is what we're all about, is caring for needs. But all of us as believers need to look around us in our communities, our neighborhoods, and see what are the needs. Disciple making, preaching the good news of the kingdom. Remember, Jesus preached the good news of the kingdom. He is our model. We are to disciple new believers. It's not to go on a mission trip and have 100 people say they want to follow Jesus and then nothing else happens. They must be discipled. They must learn. They must know what it is to be a follower, a learner from Jesus. And disciples multiply. So if you're making disciples, they're going to make more disciples. This is a story from Africa. And there was a nurse practitioner in this particular place, and there were some local government clinics. She observed that the people, they just had very few drugs, and really the care was rather not so good. And she went to them and she said, I'm willing to be of some help if you would like for me to help. Oh yes, they would like for her to help. So she began rotating amongst these 3 clinics. She partnered with a local congregation of believers who would also just go and hang out around the clinic with her and talk to people. In 1 year, over 1,100 new believers. and the church congregation was actively discipling them. So this is a wonderful example of making disciples. To empower the church, organize the disciples, train leaders, very important, and release them to the world. That's kind of the definition of what it means to empower the church. New churches that are formed should be, from the beginning, reproducing. They should be multiplying. The church planted needs to plant more churches, which in turn plant more churches. And so you have multiplication. If you're just planting a church this year, next year you plant a church, and next year you plant a church, that's very good. But if those churches are not reproducing, your long-term effectiveness is not going to be, it's going to be limited. So multiplication. That means you've got to train lay leaders in these groups. Obviously, in this place, you're not going to have pastors who've been trained. And so you're going to be training lay leaders. Nationals should be involved early on in discipling, in baptizing, and training. And once you've kind of got this thing going, you can move on to a different community and start again. This is a story from East Asia. There were some Bible school students, and they wanted to start some new work in surrounding villages, but they had no access. They were not welcome, and they didn't know how to, really start. So what happened was they were trained to tell health stories, basic health education, things like washing hands and the very basics. And they went to the village leaders and said, we're able to offer some health talks. Would you like for us to come and do that? Well, yes, that would be okay. So they proceeded to do that. And of course, soon they're telling Bible stories. They gained access to 3 new communities. They got into 250 homes. There were 128 new believers, and they started a church. And now those students, having graduated from Bible college, no doubt, will go out to wherever they're going to minister, and they will continue to do this. They'll probably learn more stories to tell. The healthcare professional has a very unique role, and this is something that all of us need to understand and appreciate and take advantage of. The healthcare professional can cross every geographic barrier. It doesn't matter country, it doesn't matter rural, it doesn't matter urban, whatever, anywhere. They can cross every economic barrier. The very rich, the poorest illiterate villager, any of those. They can cross every cultural barrier. And this is so remarkable, almost immediate trust relationship that permits intimate conversations. You can get to a spiritual conversation usually almost within minutes. It might take another person months to get to that point in that relationship with that person to be able to have a spiritual conversation. Now, I would say to you, I don't think there's any other profession that we can say this about. Business people, yes, have a wonderful access, especially in urban, especially in better socioeconomic. But you put the corporate businessman in the most remote village, and he may be a bit lost and doesn't know what to talk to them about. And they've never heard of such a person. So the healthcare professional has a very unique role. I want to just give you a few more stories. This is a program in Central Asia. Directly observed therapy for treatment of tuberculosis is the method of treatment advocated by the WHO, the World Health Organization. Tuberculosis is a disease that requires treatment over months by tablets, occasionally injections, and what happens, as you can well imagine, is that people are not always compliant. And they quit taking their medicine, and they don't take it for as long as they're supposed to. And what happens then is, how do I go back? Is drug-resistant tuberculosis. Well, we're really going the wrong direction. Sorry, just a minute. Let me get reoriented here. There we go. What happens is we get drug-resistant tuberculosis, which is a huge medical problem in the world. Well, this is Central Asia. It is a people group with no known believers. It is remote. It is very difficult to access physically and politically. So they decided that what the access would be was a directly observed treatment program for TB, which was widespread in these villages. They trained 3,000 community workers so that in the village they could identify people that might have TB, diagnose it, and then directly observe them swallowing the pills. Well, this strategy would have been even more wonderful, of course, if there had been any believers whom they could have trained to do this, but there weren't any. These were just people in the village. But what happened was the national local doctor who headed the project, over time, became a believer. He has since been in prison. He has since twice escaped the country but gone back. He is now leading 2 or 3 church planting networks over that country. And besides that, in the people group that was the original target, where there were no believers, today there are at least 100 believers and maybe more. So in a very restricted place, this is a remarkable story. This is an example of another strategy. Women all over the world are faced with the problem of breast cancer. Even in the West, this is a good strategy. And so what they did was to organize, they would just have a small group of ladies in a community, a neighborhood, or whoever, and they have worked out the lesson plans, and it's 4 sessions in which they basically talk about breast cancer and self-examination and that sort of thing. And it's creating awareness. They couple it with Bible stories. We are seeing, this began in South Asia, but it's now being used over many parts of the world. They're seeing women coming to faith. They then lead their husbands to faith. Families are coming together, and churches are being started through a very simple strategy. And I would see how in some areas, even in the West, in Europe and North America, this could be a successful strategy. This is an alcohol rehab project. Addiction to alcohol and drugs is a problem in so many parts of the world. And this particular problem dealt with alcoholism in rural people in South Asia, a huge problem. And basically, the program was initiated by village leaders who then came forward and said, we need help with this bad problem. And so it was that they began to have a series of 12-day, they call them camps. They bring together 12 or 15 alcoholics and withdraw them, and they usually get sick. And they have all the medical people are there, the chaplain, the social worker, the psychiatrist, all those people are there. And they do many things in the 12 days. And then they follow that with weekly support groups, much like Alcoholics Anonymous would do. It has been remarkable that some of these have become believers. The abstinence rate at 6 months is over 40%. AA considers it good if they get 20%. So this is a really amazing thing. This particular picture, I was out in the village one day in India. This was in India, and I can say that. I was out in the village, and these guys were having their weekly meeting. The chaplain was there, and she said to one of them, stand up, tell your story. So this little village man, illiterate, he gets up, and he tells his name, and then he says, I drank alcohol. I had no job. My family did not have food. There was no peace in my house. And I went to this camp. And they took away the alcohol, and I got sick. But while I was there, I heard this story. This story was about a man, and he had 2 sons. And the younger son went away, and he did so many bad things. And he lost all he had, but he went back home, and his father received him. And I learned that there is one true God, and that God loves me, and that God would forgive me. Now I have peace in my heart. There is peace in my family. I have a job. We have food to eat. He sat down. 2 more men got up and told basically the same story. Just last August, I was out in a village and met another man who'd been through this program. More than 2 years ago, he became a follower of Jesus, and he's now starting a church in his village. So these are examples of strategic medical missions. This was a volunteer team that went to the Middle East to deal with refugees from the crisis going on there. And they were able to pray with 70% of the patients. Now, that in itself is pretty remarkable. And we're talking about behind closed doors, okay? They have access, they're behind closed doors, they're caring for needs. Well, they had over 100 contacts out of that, all those hundreds they took care of. I think they took care of 600 or 700 people. 100 solid contacts that the field workers were going to be able to visit immediately as soon as they left. So the partnership is key, and the follow-up is key. You know about the earthquake just about a year ago right now in Nepal. Southern Baptists have been very active in responding and doing many things, shelter, all that. And then we've had 9 medical teams over months who went. We have given care, we've shared the gospel. One story was just great. There was a village that was just like almost in the epicenter of the quake. And it was in the district that where we've been working. There were believers there from some time back. They had been so severely persecuted that most of the Christians had left that place. But the little Nepali man who was the pastor and just a handful of believers had stuck it out. They had been beaten. Everything had happened to these people. Well, then the earthquake occurs. Then we come and we're providing relief and help and all that. After a number of weeks, the village leader came to that pastor and said, "We were wrong. We were wrong about the Christians. We thank you. You are free to be here. We want to encourage you. We'll even provide a plot of land where you can have a church." And people are coming to faith. That's an example of a disaster response. East Asia. This is actually the field workers are doctors, a couple, a doctor and a doctor, couple. They were sent to East Asia and were told that their target people were medical professionals. Well, they're in this, of course, I guess every city in that part of the world is big, but this city was big. And the world's biggest hospital is in this city, 6,000 beds. It's huge. Well, the medical professionals there were just like they are here, a bit resistant, difficult to access, self-sufficient, well-educated. They've got it all in hand. Well, so what are they to do? They began working in a clinic, actually an international clinic. They were taking care of foreigners. Well, that wasn't their target group, but there they were, and relating to staff in the clinic. But the husband began going to the hospital and observing and making rounds and just becoming part of the scene. So they hit upon the idea of having volunteers come and teach short term, like a week. The first volunteer was an anesthesiologist, and ahead of time he sent a list of possible lectures that he could give, and one of them was a spiritual topic, and they could choose what they wanted him to talk about. Well, they chose the spiritual topic. Well, he arrived. First day was the spiritual topic. At the end of the session, the authorities came to him and said, you can't come back anymore this week. And he called the field worker and said, this has happened. Well, the field worker thought, we're all going to be deported. But what the problem was, it was when they were having a SARS epidemic. And because he was a foreigner and hadn't been quarantined, they didn't want him running around the hospital and infecting all their people. But the contacts that he had in that 1 hour, people wanted to talk. And instead of giving lectures, he spent his week in a tea shop having conversations. Those field workers, in their first term of 4 years, started 3 house churches among healthcare professionals. They are now 7 years into their work there, and there now is another house church. All are led by local people. They are baptizing people almost every week. They are training more leaders. Those house churches are now going out on mission, even outside that country. So it is a great story. Well, moving on, I want to just take a very few minutes now and tell you a little of my own story, because it does represent medical mission to church planting, and then we'll have 5 or 10 minutes for questions. I served, as you heard, in the country of India and South India. I grew up in the home of a Baptist pastor, and I heard about Jesus from earliest time, and I was about 5 years old when I came to know Jesus personally as my Savior. When I was 13, God spoke to me about being personally involved in foreign missions as a physician. And so it was that I was really focused thereafter on preparation. The last phase of my preparation was training in general surgery, which I did in Dallas, Texas. And at this point in time in the United States, women did not go into surgery. And if you notice my final year of residency picture, I am the only one amongst all those gentlemen on the faculty and fellow residents. God led me to serve in the Bangalore Baptist Hospital in South India. It was established by Southern Baptists in 1973. Officially 80 beds when it opened, but when I got there were only 40 actually. It was brand new. And in 1989, the management of the hospital was given over to an ecumenical, excellent Christian institution in South Asia, the CMC in Vellore. We began educational programs in the 90s, and over these now 40 plus years, the hospital has just continued to grow and expand. Obviously, I worked in the clinic. I saw patients, had wonderful opportunities there to share my faith, to pray with patients. Labor and delivery, I did end up having to deliver babies. It looks like the surgery picture has opted out of the presentation. I don't know where it went, but I was in surgery a lot since I am a surgeon. And then it was not long before I ended up in administration. And became the CEO of the hospital, dealing with files. This was pre-computer days, and nobody had ever trained me, in financial management or personnel management or any of those things. Education was a major part of what we did in the hospital. And in the 90s, we started allied health programs, residency training for doctors, and then the School of Nursing in 1996. In August, we'll be celebrating our 20th birthday, and we're very excited. The alumni are very excited too. And then we also train hospital chaplains. I had opportunity also to have relationships and even to share my faith in my home, as I invited just all kinds of people to my house. This is Christmas tea party. I was telling somebody yesterday, one day at one of these functions, a Hindu anesthesiologist looked at one of my nativity scenes, and he said, could you tell me about this? Tell me this story. And another time, one wanted to know about the Christmas tree. My Christmas tree, was 2 feet high in a pot, but it was a Christmas tree. And I could talk about an evergreen and then everlasting life through Jesus, and that was what the Christmas story was about. I played the piano. Through college, I played the piano, and then I thought that part of my life was over, but it wasn't. And we were able to organize a hospital choir in the 1980s. I accompanied the group and often directed it. A group of hospital staff, from doctors to helpers. And we sang in English, we sang in harmony. They couldn't read music, and it was quite an experience. But we performed all over our city multiple times for years. Wonderful PR for the hospital, but a tremendous witness for Jesus. And this particular picture was taken as we were being filmed for a Christmas TV program in our city. So another major role was church planting and having opportunity to work with Indian pastors and evangelists in starting churches. My last 10 years of service with the IMB was spent directing strategy to reach people for Jesus in our state. In South India, 54 million people, most of whom, of course, do not know Jesus Christ. This is the hospital, just quickly to show you a few pictures. When I arrived, the campus was barren except for one building, had no trees or flowers, and it's a beautiful place today. This is our radiotherapy unit, full cancer care. Almost 250,000 patients treated in the clinics. I remind them regularly, and they probably get tired of that no one comes to the hospital by himself. They're visitors and family and whatever. At least 500,000 people would walk through there every year, at least. And almost all of them lost without Jesus. We reach out to the community. We cover about 50 villages north of our city. We have an urban health center, a slum of 75,000 people that we provide the care. This includes care, education, health education, lots of projects like the Alcohol Project, Disability, a cardiovascular project, a senior citizens daycare, things like that. We have palliative care, 3 teams that are in homes, both rural and urban. Spiritual ministry is a priority. 10 chaplains in our hospital who are involved in training. They, of course, are involved in visiting patients. They minister to 1,200 employees and about 500 trainees and students. They do follow-up as people are interested in knowing Jesus. They visit in homes. This slide is incorrect. We had 897 professions of faith in 2015 in the hospital. This is just one small example of a medical mission to church planting. A lady came to the hospital probably in the mid-'80s. She was illiterate. She was from a village, a very poor village of migrant workers that worked in quarries. She was interested. The chaplain went to her village and visited. She became a believer. She told her neighbors and family. Eventually, there were 5 or 6 people. They became a church. They met under a tree. And sometime in the 90s, they got a little teeny plot of land and they put up a 10 by 20 foot mud hut. That was their church, and they were very, very happy about their church. And then I think it was in 2004 that we dedicated this permanent building. By then, the church had about 75 members. It was starting other churches in the villages around, and it has continued to be strong and to grow. Now, that is just one example. The hospital has been key in starting hundreds of churches over these 40 plus years. This is a book that you all need to read, whether you're non-medical, medical, whatever you are. It's called Preach and Heal. It is by Charles Fielding. That is not his full name. And you notice the picture, a 2-handed plow. And you think, what in earth does that have to do with preach and heal? Well, preach and heal go together. It is true for every believer. We are to care for needs. We are to share the good news of Jesus Christ. If you just hang on to one handle, it's going to go off on a tangent and not reach the end of the road. So you got to hang on to both. And you must preach and heal. It is proclamation. It is demonstration. I was in a conference a few months ago, a women's meeting, nothing to do with medical missions, but I was doing a breakout on medical missions. And these ladies, and I talked about the ABCs. A few months later, I get an email from a woman who had been there that day. She was not medical at all. She had ended up in the room, she said, quite by accident. She did not want to hear about medical missions, but she heard about the ABCs, and she said, I've been wondering how I could minister to my neighbors in my street. And now, once I heard those ABCs, I got it. And she said, now I'm trying to find out their needs. I'm trying to do all this. I'm getting into their homes behind closed doors. I have access all over the neighborhood, and I'm sharing Jesus. It's for everybody. So, as Christ's followers, our mission is to make disciples. Healthcare professionals do have a role to meet needs and to tell people about Jesus. A medical mission is strategic, physically and spiritually, and it can and must lead to church planting. We have about 7 minutes, and I shall be happy to answer some questions if you would like to ask me something. Yes?
So in the hospital setting, what is how did you bridge the way that you were able to share the gospel with these people? Was it just simply saying, can I pray with you? Or was it just saying, can I tell you a story? How would you do that?
The question is, how in the hospital setting can you bridge between the care you're giving and sharing the gospel? Yes, we do pray with patients, always with permission, always in the name of Jesus. I prayed with every patient before surgery. Sometimes in the clinic, sometimes in the ward, they share some other problem, family, finance, whatever kind of problem, and to have opportunity to pray for them regarding that problem. Sometimes to tell my own story. When I face trouble like that in my life, Jesus is the one who really helps me. Could I tell you how Jesus helps me? And, nobody can argue with that. And so I could tell. And then maybe there would be opportunity for a follow-up conversation. We had tracts, Bible portions, Gospels on the wall in every room in the hospital that people could take. We had little services. We used films, media with patients. And then maybe that in response they will follow up with questions. So there were we used all those means. Another question, yes?
Yes, can you talk about the risk of doing health missions in India? Recently I looked at
How do you deal with the situation in India where there is government opposition in visa applications and so forth? I believe that a principle in life is, of course, to be honest. It does not mean that you always tell everything. You know, you can be honest and maybe not tell an untruth. That part of the application about you agree not to proselytize, we've had some short-term volunteers, and it doesn't, interestingly, is not come up with every application, but it comes up sometimes, and some of our volunteers refused to sign it because they couldn't say that, and they got their visas. Now, a lot of other volunteers who didn't even have that form to sign didn't get visas. We're having tremendous difficulty in India now. Risk, obviously you use your common sense, but within the hospital, we have not had so far trouble, and a prayer is that there will be unhindered witness. Outside in the villages, you have to be a bit more circumspect, and that's why you want things that get you behind closed doors into homes, exactly for that reason. When I went to India, we'd go out to the village on Sunday afternoon with our tracts and Bibles and stand up by the well and tell Bible stories. You could not begin to do that today. And we used to take the Jesus film and the generator and, you know, just on the side of a house, show the film. No way today could we do that. You would be probably killed. And so, you know, you do it inside the house in a small group. Well, it turns out with a small group, it's almost more effective because then you really can get into conversation about the film. So you work around all those things. I don't know if that answered your question.
It helps. We have 200 churches in the last 7 years in India. I'm part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And a group of us are going there in May. So that's why I was asking the question to India. So you help me. Yeah.
Well, it's becoming more and more difficult in India. This lady says she is going in May with a group from church. It's difficult, yes. Someone else. We still have 2 minutes.
Last question. Go ahead.
We frightened them so much they won't ask. Okay.
Are you related to Judge Naylor?
Am I related to Judge Naylor? Not that I know of. I thank you so much for your attention. I've enjoyed being with you.